so wonderful to be here with you guys. My name is Belen Bonilla. I'm the Strategic Engagement Associate here at PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to conducting independent research at the intersection of religion, culture, and public policy. Today, I'm here to talk about a new book with the author of this book and some amazing experts. This new book is hot off the presses. It is The Politics of Gen Z. And we are here with the author herself, PRRI CEO Melissa Deckman. And I'm going to go ahead and also flag that we've got a Q&A box here for you guys. So if you have any questions you want to ask the panelists, feel free to drop them in there, and I'll be monitoring that throughout this conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and pass to Melissa to tell us, and we'll just go around and do introductions and share name, title, and your connection to politics of Gen Z and gender.
Great. Thank you so much, Belen, for hosting today. And I want to say a special thank you to Kelly, Nadia, and to Elena for joining me today. I've been a very long-time fan of both Nadia and Kelly's work. I'm hearing more and more from Elena on NPR, and I'm always excited to hear her stories covering the youth beat. So I couldn't be happier to have these voices with me today to give me their thoughts on the book, but also to really talk about where we anticipate Gen Z to be this election cycle in November. So I'm the CEO of PRRI. Prior to that, I was a political science professor for more than 2 decades. And as you can imagine, my research covers gender, religion, and politics. So I'm going to pass it over to Kelly.
Sure. So thank you, Melissa, and congratulations on this book. I'm so excited that it's out in the world and we can all use it, and it's not come out at the best time because, of course, this is such an important topic as we go into this election. And thanks to the team at PRRI. My name is Kelly Dittmar. I'm the Director of Research at the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University, where I'm also an Associate Professor of Political Science. And a lot of the center's work and my own work is focused on gender and elections. So really looking forward to this conversation. And I'll pass it to Nadia.
Thanks, Kelly. And big thank you to PRI and to Melissa for writing this book. I am a bit spoiled because I got to read it in advance, so I was able to blurb the back of the book, and this was really a great honor. I'm super excited to be here today to have this conversation. And I'm a little bit disappointed that I'm not teaching a grad course this semester because I would have assigned it. Okay, so I'm Nadia Brown, and I am a professor of government and the director of Women's and Gender Studies at Georgetown. And I come to studying gender and politics because I'm an expert in Black women's politics. Haven't done as much stuff around Gen Z, but the research that I've done looks at generational gaps and how Black women in particular legislate. And I'll pass it over to Elena.
Thank you so much. My name is Elena Moore. I'm a political reporter at NPR News, focusing on new voters this election cycle. So that is Gen Z. That's also just anybody who hasn't voted before. Obviously, you don't have to be a young person to be engaging for the first time, but often that does fall to younger people. And I'm really honored to be here. I've learned a lot reading this book, and also at times felt a little bit comforted seeing some of the things I've heard anecdotally or seen in NPR's own polling reflected in the in-depth and detailed and thoughtful work that this book does. And also my lights turn off randomly, so that's just going to happen. But yeah, really excited.
Awesome. Well, sounds like we're in for a great conversation, and we're going to dive right in. So Melissa, tell us about this book and what you learned talking to Gen Z.
Great. So just to give you a very quick overview, I hope that the major takeaway for people reading this book is to understand that to really know the politics, the political behavior, the priorities of Gen Z, you really have to understand the influence of gender on their politics. It's really, really critical. And in my book, I show that Gen Z women are far more liberal than their male counterparts. I would argue that they're fiercely feminist. I show that they're more likely to embrace the feminist moniker than older women, than certainly young men. And it's those progressive values, those feminist values, that are fueling them to participate at higher levels in politics than their male counterparts. And during the Trump presidency in particular, I document that for the first time, young women were more engaged in politics than men. And also I document that it's not just Gen Z men and Gen Z women where you're seeing these differences. Zoomers who identify as LGBTQ are also engaging in politics at higher levels. So I think that's really important to kind of take away from this research. So why are we finding this, and what inspired the book? The book was actually inspired by Public Religion Research Institute. Now, this happened before I became the CEO, but in 2018, they partnered with MTV to do a survey of the attitudes of younger Americans. And they found that Gen Z women, or young women, 18 to 24. So you had some little, I guess, some of the latest millennials mixed in there. But among 18 to 24-year-olds, their study found higher levels of engagement on all sorts of things compared to young men. I have studied gender and politics for decades, and I know that up until well through the 20th century into the early 21st century, men overall were more likely to participate in politics than women. Now, women do vote at higher rates, but that's about the only area where you see that kind of imbalance happening. But what I was really struck by was this new data showing all of a sudden we see animated young women here in ways that we really haven't seen before. And so that really inspired me to take a deeper look from the study. I was also inspired by youth-led activism that was happening during the Trump administration. I thought it was unbelievable to see during that administration the surge of activism happening, whether it was climate strikes, whether it was the response to the horrible shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School that inspired March for Our Lives, whether it was toward the end of Trump's presidency and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. All of a sudden, we saw young people in the streets, and by and large, it was often young women who were leading those marches. So all of those things led me to want to undertake this study to try to see what was happening. Why were Gen Z women surging ahead? And so I conducted this book, the research for this book, over a couple of years using what political scientists would call a mixed method approach. I collected my own national survey data. I conducted 15 focus groups of Gen Z Americans in 4 college campuses across the country, as well as I attended a conference for Ignite, which is a nonpartisan organization that trains young women to become political leaders and encourages them to run for local office. Ignite also very generously wrote some of the cost of some of the survey research and focus groups that I did. But I also spoke with Gen Z activists. So I spoke with more than 90 Gen Z political activists, many of whom had founded their own political organizations. Pretty remarkable people. And I will note that even though most of the people that I spoke with were women and were on the political left, because in reality, you'll see that Gen Z tends to be more leftist than rightist, I guess you could say. I did speak to conservative women, and I also spoke to men as well, both from the left and the right, and some non-binary activists too. So here's what I found, taking all this data together. So the forces that are driving Gen Z women's leftward trajectory and higher levels of engagement are both political and cultural. So let's talk about the politics. So by and large, one of the main reasons explaining the surge of activism among young women is Donald Trump. I mean, it was very clear that Trump's election really galvanized these young women who, of course, as we know in social science, are coming into politics during their impressionable years. So they're really starting to think about politics concretely in ways they really didn't do, in middle school and their younger years. So they see Donald Trump defeating Hillary Clinton, who is arguably one of the most qualified women to ever be president. But it was really more, I think, Trump's blatant sexism, the way that he spoke about women, the way that he bragged about assaulting women. I remember that famous, infamous Access Hollywood videotape or audio tape. Those sorts of things really left, I think, a huge impression on Gen Z women. They realized that sexism wasn't a thing of the past. Moreover, well into Trump's presidency, you had the eruption of the Me Too movement. And that Me Too movement, again, further cemented for young women the idea that gender equality was not guaranteed and that they needed to do more to, in fact, to support or to fight for gender equality. Moreover, and we'll talk hopefully a little bit more about this in the webinar, there were some profound political role models emerging for young women, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was a name I heard a lot when I talked to young women. She is, of course, someone who was younger, who was a social justice activist before she became elected to Congress, and she, of course, is diverse. And she had a very, I think, important effect on galvanizing young women who suddenly saw someone that looked more like them than all the old white guys they were really sick of seeing involved in politics. And of course, more recently, we've seen with the Dobbs decision, a further, I think, level of interest, a resurgence of interest in politics among young women who realize that their rights are being taken away. But it wasn't just the political events, I think, that led to young women being more interested and involved in politics compared to young men. It was also cultural. So two things to point out here, and then I'll turn to the rest of the panel. One is this, there was, I think in the last decade or two, efforts to really build self-esteem among young women from a variety of vantage points. So you had a surge of young women playing sports. We know that if you play sports, you're actually more likely to be involved in politics. And that's taken a couple of decades to really sort of filter out in terms of the effect in terms of the politics. But I think that's an important thing that's happening. You had all these efforts to get young girls and young women involved in STEM careers. These are traditionally male careers. And you also had, in fact, groups like Ignite or Girl Up, Girl Scouts really talking about the importance of civic engagement. I talked to the president of Girl Scouts for my book, and she talked about these new badges they created, trying to get young girls, often for their go-towards, to go out and to actually do civic engagement. So all of those things build what political scientists like to refer to as internal political efficacy, the idea that you can actually make a change in government. There's that cultural, I think, event happening. At the same time, we have to talk about social media. For good or for bad, Generation Z is chronically online. But I think it's really in understanding the politics of Gen Z. Gen Z is the first generation that both produces and consumes its own media. Again, both good and bad elements of that. But at the same time, it's been a remarkable tool for organizing. So young people can find people that agree with them, like-minded citizens who not only are learning about politics, but are taking what they learn and using it as a tool for organizing. And I think those two things, these kind of cultural imperatives to build self-esteem in girls combined with social media access, has really led to a proliferation of engagement among Generation Z. So I'm going to stop it at there because I want to hear other thoughts as we're moving forward.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, as a member of Gen Z, I can definitely resonate with the thought of being chronically online. To our panelists, I'd love to hear some of your initial reactions to these findings. How do they compare with what you're seeing of this generation? Are there aspects of the findings that align with or challenge what you're seeing? And maybe we can start with Elena, in terms of your reporting on the ground, covering Gen Z activism and this presidential election. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, well, I think there were things that points in this book that resonated with what I've heard on the ground, both talking to young people on college campuses and also getting to hear from and learn about the different youth-focused organizations that are in the political fight here. I've talked to so many, especially on the left, young organizers who got involved, maybe in 2020, maybe in 2018, in organizing and getting their generation out to vote. And, now when we look at this election, I was just at the DNC and I'm sure we'll talk about that, but there were like a handful, maybe closer to 10 events, either run in part by some of these youth focus groups, run in part by the Democratic National Convention, the Harris-Walz campaign. These organizers are growing up as so are their prominence in these groups, if that makes sense. So in some ways, getting to work, report on these young people as they age into politics has been really fascinating because they're also getting more of a voice. But I would say that my biggest things from this book that stuck with me, I think first and foremost, I really appreciated, Melissa, that you dove into some specific issues that really resonate with this generation, because the one thing I've heard over and over again is that these young people, anecdotally, but we have seen in some polls, they don't resonate with a party in the same way that we've seen among older generations, but they are fueled by these issues. And obviously we'll talk about Trump being a catalyst in some ways, but talking about climate change and gun violence prevention. These are things that we know inspired movements among young people. And I think to really dedicate time in your book to seeing how they especially affect young Gen Z women was so smart. And then the last thing I'll say is I thought that the role model effect, looking at Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was fascinating. Something about her as a political leader. And again, we'll get into all of those aspects of what that means. But the book talks about young people being inspired by her, as you just mentioned. But specifically her communication style is something I've heard from young people really resonates with them. That idea of being frank, honest, unfiltered, that is a strategy we've seen candidates emulate since then. Not saying she invented it, but I think she communicates to young people, in addition to just being a younger person, she communicates in a way that's quite appealing to them. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Maybe I can jump in,
Mhm.
Belen. So two things struck me, and I probably would have had a different, I mean, I have a pre-written kind of like a canned response, but Melissa's opening comments really dovetail nicely to what I was doing this morning. So I am I'm a troop leader for my kids' Girl Scout troop, and I've taken over the brownies. I'm sorry, no, I'm the daisies, and we're combined troop. But I had proposed to the other parents that I was going to do a civic education lesson plan for them and try to find the badge. And my previous experience was that that's it's work, right? It's stuff that I can do as a political science professor, but it's definitely work that I have to put into this to prepare a lesson, particularly for younger people. Brownies are first grade, sorry, they're second grade to fourth grade. Daisies are kindergarten to first. But I'm saying this to our Girl Scout troop manager, and she pulls up from the Girl Scouts webpage a whole list of curriculum and activities to do around civic engagement for 5-year-olds, right? And for these daisies. And so this just got me to think about the way that younger people are being socialized, even at 5, to be civically engaged towards, right, a feminist agenda, because these women are learning, well, these young girls are learning like women's empowerment, right? And they are getting the basics of political socialization in one that doesn't see girls as a deficit model or in this deficit model, but rather as empowering. And I would be so interested, right, to see what this trajectory looks like from, what's happening to this alpha generation, or even if these daisies have a generation yet. I don't know if they have a title yet, but right, but it's just it's a big difference than when I was a Girl Scout several years ago. And so I think that the progress that we're seeing here in this Gen Z moment, just evidenced by what these organizations are doing for those that can't vote yet, aren't even necessarily thinking about politics yet in a more traditional way, gives me hope for this younger generation. And then the next thing that really stuck out to me, and I know that and I sent this in an email to Melissa, I know that I read other people's books through my own vantage point as a researcher. So the things that I think the book is about are really the things that I find most interesting in the book. And then other people read it and they say, well, I don't think that was the primary focus. But for me, the primary focus of this book were the way that non-binary people and queer folks and women of color in particular are really driving an ideological shift in how they're thinking about politics and particularly party politics. I found that to be really, really telling, particularly because of the role modeling effect, right? So what is it to grow up and see Black women in power from my own research? And thinking about a generation of folks who, right, like it or love it, have seen Kamala Harris before she was VP, have seen Black women political leaders, and just take that for granted, right? And this is also a generation of people who were born during Obama's presidency, right? And so their orientation towards who can be a politician is completely different than what it was for I'm a geriatric millennial, for people in my age cohort. And then lastly, the thing that I think has been what I've been mulling over the most, and not in a overly concerned way, but just something I think that we should put on our radar of, right, what's happening with men. And I do think that, right, the feminization of politics is a good thing for everyone, right? And it's not um, men versus women. Rather, right, as Gen Z is showing us, right, gender as a binary is pretty ridiculous and we just shouldn't do it. But instead, right, what are the kind of feminine traits or values that we bring to politics? And I'm the same way I'm thinking about my daisies, my Girl Scout troop, I'm wondering what this feminization of politics will do to this alpha generation who might not think about themselves in gendered bodies in the same way that people in our generation do, but can think about politics as terms of having compassion or care for your neighbor and trying to enact policies that will do the most good for everyone. And I kind of already have started seeing this, and maybe Melissa, you can talk a little bit about this too, as ever being a professor for 20 years. I've been a professor for 14 years. And what's distinctly different from this generation of students that I'm teaching than my previous generations of students are indeed their care about politics that impact more people than just themselves, right? So they're not looking at like pocketbook issues, and they're not thinking about things in terms of like conservative or liberal, and these are all the things in the book. But what really strikes me is they're like, if I'm going to be a single issue voter, it's going to be on the environment, because none of this matters if the world is on fire, right? And the student, and I never would have heard environmental activism when I started this job, right? And environmental activism, if at all, was something that was distinctly more feminized, right? It was not something that the young men in my classrooms were talking about. So I'm hopeful, by and large, particularly for Gen Z, but really for what's coming next.
Thanks, Nadia. I think picking up on that thread of what's happening with Gen Z men, I'm wondering, how do you guys think Gen Z men are conceptualizing figures like Tim Walz, who's a veteran and a former high school coach, or Doug Emhoff, who could be our first ever first gentleman, compared with former President Trump and Senator J.D. Vance? Do you think these men contrast with the traditional perception of masculinity when it comes to the presidency? And maybe we can go over to Kelly, who I know has a expertise in gender and masculinity.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think what's so valuable that we're seeing with these contrasts is kind of diverse masculinities and performances of manhood, if you will, right? Like, how are they performing gender among these men? And it ranges from a toxic and kind of patriarchal version of masculinity to performances of manhood in the case of Doug Emhoff in particular, but Tim Walz as well, that kind of balance traits and qualities that are often more associated with femininity. And Nadia alluded to this, even just like compassion and empathy. As something that we have traditionally associated more often with women, but maybe we should actually revalue and rethink about what we want in our political leaders in ways that are less about feminine, masculine, or any binary, and more about these valuable traits. I think Walz and Biden and Obama before him disrupts expectations of masculinity of the presidency in particular, that assume that masculine credentials are what you need in order to do this job. They're often embodiments of like brute force. I mean, Donald Trump just put out an ad today, if any of you saw, where he's like in the knockout suit, right? Which is him knocking out Biden in the debate, and then it's like punching bag, right? So all of these like very clear demonstrations of the most blatant form of masculinity, dominance, protection over women instead of empowerment of women. So you see that contrast between Vance and Trump and somebody like Tim Walz. The other thing that's interesting, if you combine Walz and Emhoff, is they openly accept support roles, right? So disrupting what the presidential partnership, whether that be the personal partnership, the kind of husband and wife, first lady and president, in this case, first gentleman, but also the professional partnership, right? Vice president and president, so that they embrace support roles, not the dominant roles and the dominance or kind of preeminence of the female executive. And you hear this in terms of Emhoff with "these are wife guys," right? And that's a different form as well. I just want to point on this to Melissa's findings, to my favorite question that PRRI has done, and then Melissa does in the book, which is about America being too soft and feminine. And I think that gives us the best sense of how Gen Z men might respond to these different perspectives of manhood. So I'm going to cite Melissa Deckman here. 68% of Republican men agree with the statement that society is becoming too, or has become too soft and feminine. It's no surprise then that Trump and Vance are trying to play into that, right? Like that makes sense strategically. That emerges from this sense of precarious masculinity, right? Like their masculinity is threatened, and so these guys can reassert it. Importantly, though, 43% of Democratic men, which is more than the 23% of Democratic women, also agree with that statement of Gen Z men that Melissa studied. So I also want to point out that even though there is that progressive difference, I think when you read the chapter on men, you also have to look at the fact that even progressive men might have some of these beliefs that can be tapped into by a more conservative version of masculinity.
Can we have Elena? I'm just kind of curious in your reporting, because you've just come back from both conventions. You've talked with Gen Z men and Gen Z women. So what are your perspectives on this growing gender divide? It's getting a lot of attention. I have a lot to say about it too, but I'm just kind of curious on the front lines, what have you been hearing from, in particular, Gen Z men? I mean, my feeling is that the GOP this year is trying its very best to ensure that women will never vote for them again. I can't imagine a party that has been more hostile to women, and not just really on the policies, because I don't think that any generation is monolithic, right? And I take great care to talk to conservative women, and I talk to many who are who are strongly opposed to abortion, which is why they're Republican, right? But it's more of like, I think, perceptions of women, whether it's kind of a barstool conservatism of women's rights have gone too far, boys should just be boys, to really a more patronizing, I would say, patriarchal view of women from the Christian right? It's very different views of women, but ones I think that really don't allow women to have agency. But I'm just kind of curious, is this playing well with Gen Z men? What do you see, Elena, when you talk to them?
I mean, it's hard because I think I've talked to most recently folks in two hyper-polarized places, and I don't know how accurate of a representation that is to the rest of the country. I will say, like, something that stuck with me, I've gone to a few of these like conservative youth conferences, like Turning Point Action will host these events. That it's the organizing wing of Turning Point USA, which is a very big youth Republican group. And I talked to this one young man, and I just pulled it up. I asked him if he felt like there was, if men's issues were not talked about as much, or how he felt about, the politics of men. And he said something about how, like, the emasculation of the American man has gone too far, or American men have gone too far. And as Americans, we're not going to accept it, something along those lines. And I found that really striking. Of course, this is somebody who is at a conference where people are very, very conservative, very much aligned with former President Trump. I don't know how representative that is, but it stuck with me because I do think there was, and you get at this very well in the book, of there's this almost backlash to some of what we've seen among lifting up young women's voices, young women leading some of these political movements. And I've definitely heard maybe versions of that at some of these events. I'll be frank, I feel like I've talked less about gender and men's role in the Democratic Party with more left-leaning folks. And I think in part that's because, once again, the lights, I'll do that once I start moving. I think once again, that's also because they're so focused on the issues. I don't think it comes up in the same way. So I think that's something that I'm really curious to get at next time I go out and can talk to people who are less politically involved, to see if that's something they think about. Last thing I'll say, though, is one thing I do hear among, in some ways, both conservatives and Democrats, young people, is they do talk about mental health. And I think that there is a crossover with gender on that. We know, and again, you talked about this in the book, the disproportionate struggles that some young men in this country face over mental health. And I think that it's been very interesting to watch how both parties look at that in their policy. And so that's the way I've seen gender come up, I think, in policy and partially on the campaign trail. But I think my answer is kind of half answered, because some of this requires talking to just like people who aren't living and breathing politics every day.
Right. Thank you, Alina. I think just zooming out a little bit more big picture, I think we may have lost Elena for just a second, but hopefully she's coming back. I was just going to ask, what do you think that the candidacy, the historic candidacy really, of someone like Vice President Kamala Harris, the first Black and Indian woman to be at the very top of the presidential ticket, tells us about younger voters' top concerns and the political power Gen Z holds?
I'm happy to take a stab at that first, Belen. It was very clear heading into June that if Biden had remained the nominee for the Democratic Party, we were probably looking at some record low turnout among Gen Z. PRRI did a big survey of Gen Z Americans that came out in January, so please check it out. It's a really good study, but it was very clear along generational lines that Generation Z, regardless of party, is largely hungry for new leadership. And what they saw was really a tired repeat of two old white guys who've been in office for too long from their perspective. And it wasn't necessarily encouraging either Gen Z women, Gen Z men, or queer Zoomers at all. But it's been really remarkable to see how things have changed with respect to Kamala Harris being at the head of the ticket, in part because some early polling showed that Trump appeared to be making some inroads with younger voters, especially young men and young men of color. And of course, voters of colors have traditionally, especially African Americans, been staunchly Democratic. But now that Kamala Harris is at the top of the ticket, more recent polling is suggesting that we're more aligned to where we were before. And that's because in talking to some pollsters, non-voters now suddenly have gotten engaged again and interested again. So I do think that her candidacy has really revitalized interest in politics for a lot of young people. I think it's going to have a galvanizing effect on turnout for young women who, again, I wanted to call this book, but my editor wouldn't let me, No More Old White Guys, because that was a theme that I heard constantly from the young women I talked about, because if you take nothing else away from the book other than you need to know why gender matters to their politics, it's that Gen Z women in particular are very much dedicated to a more inclusive democracy. They want a democracy that looks like all of us. And maybe, to Elena's point, beyond parties, right? There's a lot of frustration with the two-party system. There's a lack of confidence in all kinds of institutions in our society. But nonetheless, I do think that having someone like Harris at the top of the ticket and having someone that embraces what Kelly was saying, sort of a more, I don't even call it healthy masculinity. I've heard of tonic masculinity, which is kind of a cool way to think about Tim Walz, the guy that's a coach, could fix your car, but isn't threatened by strong women, right? So having that, I think, at the top of the ticket has really renewed some interest for young people. I think the interesting thing will be how she navigates some of those issues that Gen Z really is passionate about. Like, I think she's still a little bit unformed. That kind of ambiguity maybe is advantageous to her now, but digging onto the issues, I think that's really gonna matter. And one final thing, and I'll let everyone speak here, it's really reproductive rights, right? I mean, reproductive rights, I think, really galvanized young women in 2022. We saw surges in voter registration, and it was really the margins were remarkable if you look at exit polls between young men and young women voting. And that is 72% of young women, according to exit polls, voted for the Democratic House down ballot. That's really remarkably high. So I'm just going to stop it there, but I'd love to hear maybe Nadia and then Kelly, as political scientists, what they think the selection of Harris will be doing for young voters today.
Oh, I agree with all of your analysis. I wanted to bring in two things. The first is, like, the book is just incredibly accurate to what I'm hearing in the classroom with my students, right? And I feel incredibly blessed to have the opportunity to be with young people every week. And I wish that there were more people who could hear from young people, right? And for those who can't, read this book. But the things that Melissa uncovers are things around, like, the enthusiasm gap that young voters really felt for a Trump-Biden rematch. But it's not just that, right? It's also what's happening lower level races, right? So it's great to put a Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. But if you look to your state legislature, if you look to your city council, if you look to the people who are making local laws and they are all, octogenarians or septuagenarians, like, that's a problem. And my young, students in my classroom are saying that, but also so are millennials who are really decrying how unaffordable it is to buy a house. And when it's people who are doing zoning laws and policies are the ones that are, cutting out multifamily units, right? Things that we know that younger people could afford. And right, it's really telling. So if we're looking at what's happening at the top of the ticket, we also need to be focusing on what's happening in our local races. So some of those people should also think about, stepping aside and letting someone else who is younger and has similar experiences or a similar, right, dog in the fight who will be here on Earth for, hopefully another 40 years or so, that they have different viewpoints. And then the second thing I wanted to add is my research team and I were in Chicago last week, and our first stop on Monday was to do to do surveys and kind of do a little bit of like interviews, but really we're there to do surveys with protesters in Union Park. And what the media wasn't covering or isn't covering, and probably even the stuff that I'm writing isn't doing such a good job about covering, is talking about women of color, young women of color's dissatisfaction with Kamala Harris. And this idea, the narrative is spun that she's she's energizing and revitalizing the party. But if she's not speaking to these women, right, the symbolicness of her politics falls flat. And I personally believe that, and this is based on my informed thoughts as a political scientist, is that right? Like Melissa's right. Like Kamala Harris is still a little fuzzy on some of the issues, but these are the issues that these women want to hear from her about. And so while Kamala Harris and Democrats have said more on reproductive justice and reproductive rights, but are unfortunately right, largely silent-esque on what's happening in Gaza right now. And the protesters really, move seamlessly from saying genocide Joe to killer Kamala, and saw the administration's policies as not much light in between her and Joe Biden. But there was this expectation that Kamala, as a woman of color, as someone who has, have her career as a prosecutor defending the most marginalized and standing up for the people, could also be standing up for people in Gaza that are having some of the same challenges as people in inner city Chicago or Detroit or DC, right? And the life chances for system impacted children of color who are under white supremacist colonial state. And so these were really clear claims, and I don't want to make it sound like the majority of people who are going to stay home because they did not hear from Kamala Harris the way that they wanted to. But I do think that there is an expectation that she should have something to say that's indicative of her lived experiences as well as her professional experiences that hasn't happened yet. And so I would think that Kamala Harris could do more in these next, 70 days to engage with young women in particular who see themselves, women in general, but who see themselves as caring for the community, of being someone who is coming to politics out of an ethic of care and social justice. And in order to win their vote, it's not enough to be, sharing a similar identity. It has to be talking to them about the policies that matter most to them. And the conflict in Gaza is chief among them.
Kelly, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say there's a couple things there, but I'll try to go really briefly, which is, I think at the same point that we're seeing this generation Nadia mentioned earlier, Gen Z, being kind of very much against categories and categorizations, and I'm not going to vote for a woman because she's a woman, and I'm not going to vote for a Black woman because she's a Black woman. And I think some of that you see in what Elena and Nadia are talking about the importance of issues. That said, when we had this woman on the ballot without a clear framing of the issues and with not much distance from Joe Biden, you saw clear jumps in participation, energy, enthusiasm in every piece of every poll. And that was including among young women of color, broadly speaking, because I think everybody's right to make sure we don't say this entire group believes one thing, right? But on the whole, we are seeing that. So I think that contrast is really important and interesting and speaks to the fact that there is some affinity politics happening here, some expectation that this person understands perhaps, or will at least bring my perspective or lived experience to the table. And maybe that changes over the course of getting to know this person better, but I think you see some energy there. Part of that is also just urgency, right? The Harris campaign has done arguably a better job of creating a sense of urgency and contrast with Donald Trump on the issues on these other issues, right? Environment, gun control, reproductive rights that Elena and Melissa have been talking about. And they're utilizing the language of Gen Z, which is very clearly also in your book, Melissa, which is social media, right? And so the effectiveness of the campaign to engage a group of Gen Z voters. I know my Gen Z coworkers who, yes, they were interested because they were already COP, staff, but are even more engaged in the campaign itself because of the way it's being communicated via TikTok or other avenues. So I think you're seeing her leverage these things in a unique way with Gen Z and quite effectively.
I just wanted to add one other point. I think those are all great points, but I think what's also remarkable is you have to remember in politics, it's not always necessarily about voting for someone, but voting against someone. And I think with respect to Donald Trump, you look at Project 2025, it's remarkable to me the extent to which I think bloggers on the left and other activists have promoted it. Like, this is a policy document maybe 20 years ago that wouldn't have been nearly as publicized, but yet the blueprint put out by 2025, which is really a Christian nationalist blueprint. I'm trying to use two words and combine them there. Nonetheless, it's really remarkable in what it says about women, its attitudes about women, about LGBTQ Americans, about families, about just individual choices, right? This idea that the state should be used to compel people to have kids, and all of these sorts of things. And I think that really, in looking at that document, has really also propelled a lot of young people to be more engaged in politics on issues that they care about.
I'll give a caveat to this though, right? Because I was coming into the convention thinking this, and also just coming into like when 2025 was dropped. But the thing that I was so just kind of gabs, whatever. It threw me off my feet. Was that right? Communities of color was like, this is what Republicans have been saying since day one, right? This is nothing new. This is just written down someplace, right? And at the DNC, there were a couple of identity group caucuses and councils, and there was time dedicated to discussing 2021. And it really were older generations of those groups who were really pushing and talking about it. And older and younger folks in the back were just saying, this doesn't matter, right? Like this, I'm not going to spend my time listening to this because it's nothing new here, right? It's just that it's written down. And then the last thing that I'll mention in regarding to this, so the stuff that we know from political science literature is that people aren't as motivated to vote against something as they are to vote for something. And that's what we saw with Joe Biden's kind of fledgling campaign, is that if they attack on just, you need to vote because Donald Trump is bad, it doesn't get people off of their sofas, right, in early November. And so the enthusiasm that Kelly was mentioning that we saw out of the gate was really a message of hope, was a message of joy, was a message of something that's forward-looking and not just fear-mongering. And as you know, scholarship says that fear is great to get the base out. Fear is great during primaries, but it's really these other emotions that get out a mass amount of people during the generals. And so that's what the Harris campaign has done so much better, and doing that by leveraging the influencers and TikTok and social media in a way that is kind of reminiscent to Barack Obama, like in 2008, but done in a way that is not by politicos or people that are trained to get out the political message, right? But having a much more organic conversation, because these influencers are doing it in their voice and not in the voice of like David Plouffe or someone else.
We are coming up on time. I do want to highlight and uplift one question from the chat that I thought was interesting here. So someone said, you mentioned that younger voters are not aligned as much with the party, but are fueled by issues. My question is, how does this not translate to a more natural automatic alignment with the Democratic Party if they are the party in our binary system that is much more pro-climate, pro-LGBTQ rights, and pro-choice than the other? So maybe that's one of the things I think you guys could respond to. Elena, are you raising?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to respond. So yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's kind of confusing, right? Because we know that in 2020, voters under 30 voted by a 24-point margin for President Biden. I think the way I think about it is young voters are very issue driven, and the issues the issues that they agree with are being championed by Democrats. But in that sense, they are still in some ways up for grabs. We saw that President Biden really suffered in the polls among young voters this year, in part because of his response to the Israel-Hamas war. And we also know, that is one issue that young voters care about. It's not the only one. We know consistently top of mind is finances, the economy, inflation, as well as reproductive rights, gun violence prevention. And so I would say I stress the party affiliation because yes, these young people vote for Democrats often, but it's more of a issue-based mindset rather than vote blue no matter who, if that makes sense. And that's, I think, one of the big reasons we've seen some division on the right about, issues like abortion access, which we know has galvanized this generation, and Melissa talks about so well in this book. And in part, and one of the reasons that a lot of these young women in the midterms voted for Democrats was to protect reproductive rights. And so I think that's kind of where I see it, and why, yes, this is a very progressive generation, liberal generation, but because they don't have allegiance to a party, and are willing to criticize the party they voted for, it kind of still leaves them open to some, questions of who they might support in the future.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Elena. I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes to just do a quick round robin of your final thoughts as we close out the webinar. What do we learn from this book that can prepare us for what to expect from the election outcomes this fall? Are there any pieces of this conversation we missed? One quick round robin, lightning round.
Let's start with Kelly and we'll go.
Yeah, I have a thing that I think is at the end of the book that I think is kind of, as we go forward, another conversation to have. So Melissa makes a point about the interest in running for office among Gen Z and the very low percentage of Gen Zers who see this as something they want to do. And I think the connection between advocacy and activism and candidacy is one that we need to think about for not only this generation, but others and other communities, especially of women. We know that women are underrepresented across levels of office. That's the work we do here at COP. So we need to be sure that in this next generation, we find ways to convince and support activists and advocates who want to go into politics. Oftentimes they find a lot of hurdles both on the way and once they're in on retaining support. So I was really interested in that finding. And I think as we think about Gen Z's political engagement going forward, we want to look at how that does translate into office holding and retention.
And I'd like to maybe respond to one of the questions in the chat that asked about the differences between Black men and Black women. So, right, in Melissa's book, the biggest difference are white Republican men, and that's just right. They're completely different. And so in all the ways that you would think, they are. But this point about young Black men from young Black women, it's also what Melissa finds is eerily similar to Evelyn Simeon's work and Black feminist consciousness that says that Black men have larger numbers of Black feminist consciousness because of their socialization growing up in communities where they see women being leaders, even if they're not formally recognized as such. But it's a different orientation to thinking about what women can and cannot do. And so that while Black men have larger numbers of feminist consciousness, they are still subjected to the culture, right, of masculinity, of patriarchy. And I think that we're seeing that, any, person goes on to talk to Charlemagne the God or, any, one of these radio shows that are really pushing a very narrow view of Black male masculinity. I'm not as concerned because they still start from a higher starting point of having more open views to gender equality, although misogyny is real, right? It's a hell of a drug, but it is something that Black men engage in. They just start from a place that is more opening and seeing women as full and equal people and as contributors to Black communities.
I can just give my final thoughts if that works as well. I think the only things I'll add I think we hit on a lot that I wanted to mention. Just on Nadia's point earlier about the organic enthusiasm, I want to just kind of flick at, it's been a really crazy month to be like a reporter focusing on Gen Z, just because everyone's like, what is brat? And I'm like, ah! But I would just say that like the memes are very fun to for young people, and there's definitely been a spike in just like interest in talking about the campaign. I mean, I used to talk to young people on campuses and say, what do you think? It's another rematch between Biden versus Trump. And I could bet like all my money that they were going to laugh after I said that. And like, this is just it's a different vibe. That said, vibes are not votes, memes are not votes, likes and shares are not votes. And so I just wanted to stress that like the organic enthusiasm is very striking. But again, as Nadia said, there are divisions within this party. There are divisions between especially young voters and young voters of color, which were the backbone of Biden's support among this age group 4 years ago. And so like, it's very, flashy and fun to report on, but it's not at all a done deal. This campaign it has to basically do double the amount of time it's already done, in the next 70 days. It's only a month old. And then the last thing I'll say is just, I think maybe Melissa, you mentioned this at the beginning, but as someone who's not steeped in, a very long time of studying generations, I've been very curious about just the like psychology of how this generation came to be what it is. And I think that the idea of fear and anger as a motivation, which I know you spoke of at length in this book, it really contextualizes some of these movements as you talk about. Like so much of this, I've found that young people are responding because of Trump, and both either that's in a negative way or a positive way. We've seen it from young conservatives who've grown up under Trump and like him because of it. And then we've seen obviously the opposite, which is so much of what this book is about. But I just, the examples that come to mind reading about that, looking at Congressman Maxwell Frost, who became a politically involved person because of Sandy Hook, the mass shooting there in 2012. Like, the Sunrise Movement, these young children getting involved, young teens getting involved because of their fear and anger about climate. I think that seeing those roots really adds a very helpful depth to this conversation and has real, tangible examples that we can easily pinpoint. So thanks again.
Thank you. Any last thoughts, Melissa?
Oh gosh, I could keep talking to you all for a very long time. I'm sorry, that went by so quickly. Anyway, I want to thank each of you for coming and sharing your thoughts about the book and your thoughts about where Gen Z is headed. I would just conclude by trying to be a little bit more forward-looking. Again, I made mention of this a little earlier, but we talk about young people's political socialization as being the impressionable years because we often know it's very sticky. So the way that people often vote when they first start voting predicts how they're going to vote for generations or decades to come, essentially. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that individuals don't change their minds from time to time. That's absolutely certain. But if you look at the values of Generation Z and you look at the values of millennials, maybe even elder millennials like Nadia, but in general, there's a consensus toward issues that are more left of center than right of center. And so I think what's going to be fascinating in the next decade to see where this all lands, if that kind of consensus stays, because I do think with Generation Z becoming a bigger part of the electorate in the years to come, I think it's going to change the direction of our politics potentially, and maybe getting back to more issue-based politics. I think what's been remarkable in the last couple of election cycles, it's been more about personality and grievance than it's been about the issues themselves. And so where this goes in the future, I'm really interested. And I'm definitely going to keep track with Nadia and her Daisy Scouts to see where they go with all this wonderful political socialization. So inspiring to hear that, actually. But I'm really just, again, the main takeaway from the book, talking to all of these activists, including activists on both sides of the aisle, is really, I think, a commitment to having more engagement and wanting a democracy that looks like the rest of us. So I leave, with some enthusiasm. And we haven't been very enthusiastic, I think, in recent years, but I think there's reason and cause for perhaps some enthusiasm moving forward. But thank you all for coming today.
Awesome. Yes, well, there's so much we did not get to, so you guys might just have to go get the book yourself to learn more about Gen Z's political power going into the 2024 election. Again, it is The Politics of Gen Z, and we've got the link in the chat here, so check it out, learn more, and follow at PRRI Poll. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day.